Hello and welcome back to Mr. Excalibur. I'm Arthur, and today we are looking at the second in a series on swords from the company Sabersmith. For those of you who aren't familiar with Sabersmith, it probably means you've probably haven't been to a Renaissance fair lately, or at least one of the big ones in the States that Sabersmith visits. That may not be a very good description these days because of what what's going on right now. This was filmed in late 2020. I know this may come out later, but obviously with that kind of date attached to it, you know what's going on these days. Most of the fairs around the country have been closed, and as a result, Sabersmith has really had to reach out in other ways. They've got a number of really cool videos, a few clips of which I've included in this one. And today, though, the one that we're looking at from them is one that I got made from them. This is their two-handed sword. Now, the interesting thing about this sword, obviously, is it's obviously inspired by a medieval design. You've got the cruciform guard here, nice leatherette handle, a nice fuller down the center of the blade, but this is definitely a modern interpretation of what would be a medieval sword. And this is the stock and trade of Sabersmith. They have several models, many of which I'm going to be looking at. This, like I said, this is the second one that I've looked at so far. I'm handling this gloves because this, of the three swords that I'm actually going to be reviewing, we have one more after this. This one is the one that was the sharpest. And I actually want to talk about that a little bit as far as how they sharpen these swords and how, as a result, they cut very differently. I'll go more into that during the cutting footage, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about how they actually sharpen these swords. The way Sabersmith sharpens their swords is very different, and that translates into how these cut as well. These swords are sharpened in a very modern, I guess you could say, knife edge fashion. The blades are hollow ground, and then the edge, to actually give it a cutting edge, is given a secondary bevel. So if you want to look at this, straight on, essentially what you've got here are two concave structures that have been built into the blade because of the hollow grind. Hollow grind, for those of you who are going, what's that? Hollow grind basically means the grind of the blade takes a slight curvature, almost like a crescent shape, and that's because the curvature of usually a belt sander of some kind that they use to remove the stock. And as a result, you wind up with, if you look very close at it, almost a curved, and then a curve of the blade kind of coming into the material. Then what they do, in order to give this actually a cutting edge, is on top of that curvature, they basically create a sharpened pyramid at the top, and of course the point of that pyramid is your leading edge. Now, they use 1075 mono-tempered steel for these swords, and they give it a really nice temper. This thing's got a nice, flex to it, and you guys will see a little bit more of that in the stock footage that I've got from Sabersmith. And you'll see how it really does take a nice, it bends pretty nice and will come back. Not so floppy, but I mean, it's got a good amount of resilience to it. Now the edge on these is supposed to be very sharp. I mean, you can, shave the back of your arm with these things. However, it's a very, very, very small cutting edge. And that's because these swords are what I call adult toys. They are real weapons. That is not a condescending remark. These are real weapons. They are solidly built. All the fittings are actually welded on. One might think that might be an issue because welds can break. Their welds do not. When I cut with this thing, it had a really interesting ring to it as it cut through some material. Again, I'll go into that more during the cutting footage. But the end result is that this is a really cool sword for just having, just displaying, also for, you know, really having some fun in the backyard without really having to worry about it breaking. This is not going to break. This, you know, you're going to have a lot of fun with this, as long as, of course, you're cutting actual material. Now, I cut milk bottles, which tend to be very fibrous, very thin, fun to cut through, kind of a poor man's bottle slash tamashigiri. But this was a lot of fun. Again, just like the last one I reviewed, it did come with a birch plywood scabbard. They are very loose. You can get a leather one. However, leather, of course, does tend to promote and retain a lot of moisture, which means you wouldn't want to keep it in the scabbard. Wood, on the other hand, does a nice job of holding the sword without it rusting. And I think that's it. To give you an idea of just how much these tend to go for, these tend to go for around $600-ish. Now, some might think, wow, that's a lot of money. But for what you're getting, it really is not. You're getting a nice scabbard that fits the blade. You're getting a lot of custom colorization on a lot of the pieces. They can do other kinds of customization. Wait till you guys see the different options you can choose on these things. And at the end of the day, you have this really fun sword that you can play around with in the backyard. Is this a historical recreation? Is this something that you would take to Long Point, or, you know, some kind of ARMA or HEMA cutting competition? Probably not. But nor are they designed to, in my opinion. These are designed to really look cool, have some fun with, and really have a nice medieval-ish look to them. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you, if you end up getting one of these, enjoy them. Thank you very much for Sabersmith, Sabersmith for making this for me. This was a lot of fun. Enjoy the rest of the information on the video. Bye-bye for now. This is the unboxing footage for Sabersmith's two-handed sword. Now, the intro here may look familiar for those who may have seen the previous video on the Elven longsword. All three of these examples, including this one and the one following this one, all came in the same box. It was all part of one order. So you guys can see here, it was packed with, of course, the styrofoam popcorn. The blades were inside the scabbards. They were lightly lubricated. They had a very light oil on them. I don't know what kind it was, but they did come oiled, but they were inside their scabbards. The blades did not have any additional wrapping around them. They were just loose inside the scabbards, and then of course the popcorn and the bubble wrap were wrapped around it. And you can see the other two models being stood up on the side over there. One of them, I'm sure, I think this last one actually is the two-handed sword for today's look. And removing everything else, yeah, there it is. They had a big thing around the hilt as to protect it. The hilt, as you guys will see, and pommel were the vocabulary they use is a tempered finish to get that color that you guys will see here in just a little bit. You'll have to forgive this little batch of unboxing footage. I aimed the camera almost too low, and it doesn't really show me wielding the sword much, but we'll see plenty of that later on. So here's a nice, some footage of the sword. And of course, you've got that belt frog that it also comes with. I didn't use it a lot, or actually at all. I just kind of slipped it off, but it's a nice little addition that they tag along there. So you can see kind of the goldish finish. It's kind of like a dingy brass that they put on it. It's a nice kind of almost antiqued gold finish that they put on the hilt and pommel. And then I asked for a blue and black handle. The sword did come pretty sharp. Now like I said, it's knife sharp. It's not sword sharp, and it's a difference in how the sword is actually ground, as I mentioned before in the introduction. And that also is going to make a big difference in how the sword cut as well. But I mean, it was just wonderfully balanced. This is not a long sword in the truest sense of the term, as far as its dimensions, how long it actually is, but it is a two-handed sword because they put this nice long handle on it, and it certainly is balanced and built for two hands. We're going to be looking at how to customize your sword through Sabersmith. You've got the various, obviously pages here. This is their page for stuff that's already ready-made. Now what I did was I, of course, took one of their designs already and I got it to order, which basically means you can choose, and we're going to go to the one we're looking at today, and that is what they call their two-handed sword. We're going to click on that. This gives you obviously an idea of how much I paid for it. This was brand new. I ordered this through them. And then the blade specs, giving an idea of what they look like. For a two-handed sword, this sword is actually a little on the short side. It simply means that the handle very comfortably fits two hands. In fact, you technically could probably handle three. It makes it very well balanced, but the blade is rather short. It's actually under 30 inches. So, again, this is, Sabersmith makes no bones about the fact that these are modern interpretations based upon historical examples. So we look at some of the options that we can choose here. We have the satin finish. This is, of course, for the blade. The acid etched. You can get it blued. These color options add a whopping $100 to the cost of the sword. So something you may want to consider, but I mean, it certainly is something to really fancy up the look of this sword. You've got the different hilt arrangements that are possible. Usually, obviously, with a straight blade sword, you might want to go with something, very crusader type. It's what I went with. But obviously, there's a lot of other options there. The guard finish is kind of the same as the blade finish. You can get them finished in that gold, purple, or just straight satin finish. No coloring at all. I went with a gold color for both the pommel and hilt coloring. There are the different pommels. I went with this hexagonal one here. That's the one I went with. You can see the different ones here. Obviously a faceted ball or just a smooth ball. So those are the different options for the pommel. And of course you can get those colored. I did. I got the pommel to match the hilt in kind of a goldish color. Then you have the handle. And I got a very simple black over blue. And actually, I think I may have gotten it over a darker blue. I can't remember exactly how I chose that. You guys can see the original, my example, and some of the pictures that I took of it. I'm just trying to get an idea of, they really do have a lot of customizations here. And to be honest with you, they'll make anything you want, but I mean, these are their standard models, so they will, make these based on the colorations and the different leather accoutrements you want and the blade. Now when it comes to the sharpness of the blade, this is something I'm mentioning for the first time. I don't think I mentioned it in previous videos. The sharpness of the blade, you can get it dull if you plan on doing stage combat. You can also get it with a sharpened finish, and upon request you can get what is called extra sharp. I got my blades, I ordered actually 3 of them from Bladesmith. I ordered them extra sharp, and this was actually after seeing a review of these on Scalagram, where he got I believe it's a scimitar through them, and he got it with their standard sharp blade, and he didn't think that was quite enough, and so I asked for it to be extra sharp. The warning did come though: if you're going to get it extra sharp, don't go against too many overly hard targets. We'll see how that turns out. This is going to be the standard intro I'm going to be giving to Sabersmith in each one of these 3 videos. So if you've seen the other 2 and are now stumbling upon this one, I'm doing 3 of these, then you may want to skip over this portion. But I thought I'd do a kind of a bit of an intro here with some clips from things that I've kind of scoured YouTube from. This first clip is when Sabersmith was being interviewed by Medieval Review, the guy from Medieval Review. For those of you who haven't seen it, I'll put the link to that full interview down at the bottom. And what's interesting here is basically Sabersmith is coming right forward and saying that the pieces that they make may be inspired by historical examples like longswords. He's holding a claymore here, even though it's actually the size of a proper longsword. He is not beholden at all to any of the standard measurements, lengths, or anything from usual historical pieces. So whichever video that you're watching right now, just know that one of Sabersmith's guiding principles is to really kind of take the next step from historical examples that they use, such as Roman gladiuses or Viking swords or medieval swords or katanas. They have all these different kinds of style of swords. It's just they definitely put their own spin on it. And actually, one of the interesting things that the owner is mentioning here is, quite honestly, if you want a historical recreation in the form of a katana or a European sword, there are plenty of other people out there who will do that for you. If that is your bag, if that's really what you want out of a sword, Sabersmith probably isn't the place to start. They are definitely looking at this from a much more modern point of view, and they're going to be taking it in a much more modern direction. They unabashedly make all of their swords in a very modern way, using modern methods. I found this clip here also. This was a kind of a little prep video that they put together to show just the sheer volume of pieces that they were getting ready for one of the Renaissance fairs that they attend. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Sabersmith, obviously up until 2020, their primary exposure has been through a series of different Renaissance fairs around the country. It's actually the place where I was first exposed to them, and they obviously have a great amount of merchandise that they are willing to bring to those fairs, and they also have some videos showing their setups at those various fairs. Some are simple tents, some are more permanent structures. One of the really interesting things that I decided to do here is, on a couple of their videos, they are showing their manufacturing techniques, and they're showing how, obviously, hollow grinding the blades here, heat tempering them. You see how they are constructing them. where you've got a pretty significant tang. That hole there is meant to hold the blade while it's being heat treated and tempered. There's the process that they're showing right there. And I thought it was really cool that they're taking some examples showing how much they flex. Here's another, shaping stock removal technique that they're showing off how they're grinding the swords. And there that is again, showing again the tangs on these swords, just how beefy they are. You can also see the welds of both the pommel and the hilts, and obviously again showing just how flexible they are. So obviously some really kind of informative footage here, all that kind of gives you an idea of what you're getting when you get a Sabersmith sword. Cutting with these swords from Sabersmith is very different, and it's hard to really compare these to any other European recreation swords, something that's really made to look like a historical recreation. You guys can see that I've mentioned before that the scabbards really are meant to just hold the swords. As far as in your home or anything else, you're going to need some kind of tie. They are nice, but they do slip out. But as I was mentioning, these swords, as far as how they handle and how they cut, it's really difficult to try and to compare this to another European, longsword or something else. A sword with a handle length of this size, if it were an actual longsword, that blade would almost be a foot longer. The blade is just shy of 30 inches, and longsword blades were easily 34, 36, sometimes longer blades. Well, maybe not quite that long, but the point is they were significantly longer than this sword. But it's, again, this is not a historical recreation. Now, something that I noticed right away as this thing cut was it does cut. It does not cleave. Now, for those of you who may not really understand what I mean there, is it very easily cut into this much heavier plastic bottle that I've got here. But it didn't cleave it in two. Now, that may be because of how it's sharpened. These swords do have a knife edge on them. They don't have a flat grind as a historical sword would, but that doesn't mean that they're not sharp. These swords, they plowed through the milk bottles like they were nothing. By the way, just as kind of a side note, I know that a lot of people will look at sword videos going, okay, why aren't you using, tatami mats or something like that? Well, as it turns out, tatami mats are actually a little on the expensive side. Whereas, where I shop for groceries and stuff, I get the bottles that come with my milk for free. So, this is not being, persnickety on people who will say that, but the nice thing about milk bottles is that, one, they're thin enough and large enough to where you can get a decent amount of cuts out of each one of them, and the plastic is not so heavy as to damage your swords. And it doesn't matter what kind of edge you got on swords, even an edge like these. When I ordered this sword, I asked for an edge which they describe as extra sharp. That, from what I understand, means that the knife edge that they do on top of the already hollow ground bevels is basically you have more blade that's exposed. In other words, they shave it back a little bit more. The knife edge or the secondary bevel that they put on is a little bit deeper, exposing a lot more of the steel. Also means that even though it's mono-tempered and it is pretty
nicely heat treated, it does mean a lot more of that exposed edge can chip if you hit something rather hard, and they warn against that. In fact, I was told when I got it that if you're going to ask for the extra sharp edge, don't you don't want to necessarily go against really hard targets. So I didn't, but it's kind of hard to say really a description of how this cut. Now, this is kind of showing what this kind of sword will and won't do. Now, if I plowed that sword in the flesh, that poor person would have lost an arm. But now, if I used a sword that was much more of a historical recreation, that sword would have plowed through that cardboard almost in half. That's been my experience with European swords. That weight at the end of the tip, the way they're designed, just absolutely cleaves those heavier targets. That isn't what was happening here. So this is kind of an interesting difference in how this sword's blade geometry cuts. It definitely will cut. I mean, it would seriously hurt a person. But as far as really cleaving them, that's not really what we see. Now, I finally got a real clean cut here into the cardboard, and it did do that. Now, here's an interesting thing about cardboard, ladies and gentlemen, and that is cardboard can actually damage your swords. Cardboard has a number of particulates in it that can actually scratch up your swords pretty bad. However, to Sabersmith's extreme credit, this is the second sword that I've plowed through some cardboard. Little, if any, scratching on the blade whatsoever. So they're 1075 high carbon steel blades. The way they've got them tempered and heat treated really has done them a great amount of credit. I saw no damage whatsoever on the blade or even on the cutting edge. So this sword was very interesting to cut with. It was fun, but again, very, very, very different. But fun nonetheless. And of course, grease it up so it's fun to play with another day.